Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
He was carving the ham like it was some kind of performance art, slow, deliberate, with the kind of smugness only a man convinced of his own superiority could manage, pausing every few slices to flash that half-grin he always wore when he was building up to something cruel wrapped in charm. The kitchen was warm, filled with the scent of cloves and cinnamon, laughter bouncing off the cabinets in that too familiar way that made everything feel staged, like we were all playing our parts in some Midwestern family sitcom. Mom fussing over side dishes no one really wanted, Dad sipping beer and pretending not to listen, and me, sitting at the far end of the table like a distant cousin at her own childhood home. And then Jake said it, loud enough to carry into every corner of the room, quiet enough to sound offhand, but sharp like a serrated knife through whatever thin piece we'd managed to lay across that table. "At least I have a real job," he said, not looking at me, of course, but at the ham. He was slicing, as if he could cut into me through the meat. The room fell into that polite silence that always follows something inappropriate in a family too passive-aggressive to address anything directly. I didn't say a word. I didn't raise an eyebrow or offer one of the sharp comebacks I'd rehearsed on the plane ride in. I just stared at the cranberry sauce congealing in a crystal dish in front of me and wondered how long I could chew on my tongue without tasting blood. And that's when Grandma, the quiet monarch of this chaotic kingdom, placed her teacup back on its saucer with that signature clink that always meant something was about to shift. She turned to me with a face that gave away nothing and said, in the softest, calmest voice you've ever heard, "Didn't you just buy the company he works for?" You know those moments where it feels like time tilts sideways? That's exactly what happened. Forks froze midair, someone's chair creaked as they stopped shifting their weight, and Jake, still holding the knife, looked up with just the slightest twitch in his temple, like he wasn't sure if he heard her right or if his world had just cracked a little. Let me rewind just enough to explain how we got here. My name's Emily Langston, and depending on who you ask in this family, I'm either the weird tech cousin who never had a real job or the one who got lucky with some app no one can remember the name of. I left home right after college, skipped the whole settle down and pop out kids route, and instead threw myself into the messiest, most emotionally exhausting relationship imaginable, a startup. Not the glossy, investor-flooded kind you read about in Forbes, but the kind that had me sleeping on my best friend's floor in Palo Alto and eating ramen for 3 meals a day while pitching ideas to men in Patagonia vests who nodded a lot and emailed never. I tried explaining it once, years ago, when I came back for Christmas and Jake asked why I didn't just apply at a real company like everyone else. I told him I was working on a platform that used behavioral algorithms to optimize logistics in e-commerce fulfillment. He laughed so hard he cried. Said, "So basically you play with computers and hope Jeff Bezos calls?" From that point on, I learned to keep things vague. Freelance tech stuff became my default answer whenever anyone asked. Easier that way. Safer. The thing is, I got good. Not overnight. Not even close. I failed more than I want to admit. I lost my first company to a co-founder I shouldn't have trusted. I burned through 3 different prototypes of a product that no one understood and ran out of money twice. But I learned. I learned how to pitch to silence, how to write code through tears, how to hide my panic under a LinkedIn smile. And eventually, when no one was watching, when I'd already given up on any kind of validation, I sold. Not big at first, but enough. And that led to another product and another team, and eventually a quiet offer from an acquisition group that changed everything. The funniest part? The company that acquired my startup was the parent group of Orion Logistics, Jake's sacred temple of middle management. I sat in the room. I signed the documents. I shook hands with board members and said words like vision and synergy, while thinking about how my brother once said I'd probably end up moving back in with Mom and Dad if I didn't get serious. And I didn't tell anyone. Not a soul. Because part of me didn't believe it either. Not until I saw Jake's name on the org chart. Not until the HR lead flagged some emails he sent that included phrases like woke interns and diversity crap. Not until I realized I wasn't just his weird little sister anymore, I was his boss's boss. So when Grandma said what she said, I didn't nod. I didn't smirk. I didn't move. I just looked at Jake as he tried to process the fact that the world he thought he ran might be sitting at the end of this table in a cashmere sweater and quiet fury. He tried to laugh, of course. Said something about Grandma getting confused again. Said I was probably just doing one of those contract things. I let him spiral. Let him dig. I knew what was coming tomorrow. The staff bulletin was already scheduled. 8 a.m. sharp. New leadership announcements. Departmental realignment. An org chart with my name in bold. But right now? Right now I let him carve that ham like he was still in charge of something, anything, while the rest of the table sat in that heavy, stunned silence that only happens when someone just realized they've underestimated the wrong person for far too long. And I just kept chewing my dry turkey and waited. Because sometimes, the best revenge doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes, all it takes is a single question from a woman with a teacup and a memory sharp enough to slice through a man's ego like it's soft ham on a glass platter. The thing about silence is that it doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone measuring the moment, quietly deciding whether to light the match or walk away, whether to unleash the storm or let the fools keep laughing just a little longer. And that night, after the ham had been carved and the final scoops of sweet potato casserole scraped from the baking dish, I sat on the edge of the guest bed in my childhood room, surrounded by old ribbons, dusty high school trophies, and a faded corkboard still pinned with college brochures I never bothered to follow through on, and thought about how close I'd come to telling everyone the truth. To standing up at that table and detailing exactly how many millions had passed through my hands while they sat there asking if I still did that little website thing. But I didn't say a word, not because I was scared, and not because I didn't want to. I didn't speak because I knew what was coming, because the real power isn't in proving yourself in a moment of pettiness, but in letting time and structure and inevitability do the work for you. And Jake, God, Jake was always so sure of himself, always talking with that annoying edge in his voice like he was the only adult in the room, like his world was the only one that mattered, like stability and routine were virtues, not limitations, and I think that's what always made him so dismissive of me, because his mind couldn't wrap itself around anything that didn't clock in at 9 and out at 5, wear a badge, or file for PTO. He had always mocked my choices, from the moment I left my job at the insurance firm to build something I couldn't even explain yet, to the day I sold my first product, a micro-fulfillment AI toolkit nobody in this town could spell, let alone understand. And if I'm honest, for a while I let those comments burrow into me, let them sit under my skin like splinters I couldn't quite pull out, because part of me had grown up craving their approval, not because I needed it to survive, but because when you're raised in a house where competence means predictability and ambition means seniority, it's easy to mistake familiarity for success. But now, sitting on that worn mattress in the room I once used to dream about leaving, I opened my laptop, clicked into my executive dashboard, and reviewed the final onboarding documents for the newly absorbed division of Orion Logistics. His division, his department, his sacred cow of a job, and I'll be honest, there was a moment, a flicker of doubt, when I wondered if this was too far, if letting him find out this way, impersonally, indirectly, through the cold machinery of corporate bureaucracy, was cruel. But then I remembered every Thanksgiving jab, every backhanded compliment, every time he laughed when I mentioned I was between contracts, and suddenly, it felt less like revenge and more like correction, a long overdue adjustment to a balance that had always tilted in his favor. The acquisition had been clean, strategic, swift, and bloodless. Echelon Systems, the tech consortium I now partially own thanks to a silent equity deal negotiated after my last product went public, had been quietly expanding into logistics, and when the time came to scoop up Orion's parent company, Atherton Dynamics, they'd brought me in not just as a face for the transition, but as a strategist, as a decider, and in the final round of discussion, when they asked me about the leadership structure of Orion, I hadn't even hesitated. I'd marked the departments for review, I'd flagged the HR audit, and I'd signed off on every clause in the new employee contracts that would go live at 8 the next morning. Not because I wanted to destroy him, but because I needed to protect what I was building, and Jake, with his outdated mindset and his casual cruelty, was exactly the kind of rot that festers in organizations until they implode from the inside. And the truth is, if he weren't my brother, if he weren't a product of the same kitchen table and bedtime lectures as me, I'd have fired him already. But I didn't. I left him in place for now because I wanted to see what he would do when the ground beneath his feet shifted, when he finally realized he wasn't the tallest tree in the forest, just the loudest. The night stretched long and heavy, the wind scratching at the windows like it wanted in on the tension, and as I lay back and stared at the ceiling, I could still hear the echo of his voice from dinner, that stupid throwaway line, "At least I have a real job," looping in my head like an old voicemail from a number you should have blocked years ago. They didn't know what I'd built, and I hadn't told them, not because I was hiding it, but because I was tired of explaining the future to people still obsessed with the past, and I didn't need applause from anyone at that table. I just needed a seat at the one that mattered. The next morning, Jake would walk into his office expecting business as usual, completely unaware that the ownership had changed, the leadership had shifted. And the eyes now watching the performance he called work belonged to the little sister he thought never made anything of herself. He would open his email and find a memo, not aggressive, not threatening, just a formal, carefully worded announcement introducing the new Chief Strategy Officer of Orion Logistics, a woman with a background in tech disruption, operational transformation, and predictive infrastructure development. He wouldn't recognize the name at first, not until he scrolled to the signature and saw it, right there in bold, beneath the crisp echelon logo, Emily Langston. And I would be exactly where I needed to be, waiting, watching, and finally in a position to decide what came next. The thing about change, real, structural, irreversible change, is that it doesn't announce itself with fireworks or sirens or some grand gesture that signals to the world that the balance of power has shifted. Instead, it slips in like fog under a door. Subtle and quiet, unassuming at first, but eventually consuming every room, every corner, every ounce of familiarity until even the air feels different, and that's exactly what happened at 8 o'clock the following morning, when the employees of Orion Logistics, including my brother Jake, opened their inboxes and found a sleek, unassuming memo with a subject line that said everything and nothing at once, leadership transition announcement. I can only imagine what Jake must have felt as he leaned back in his ergonomic swivel chair, sipping that bitter corporate coffee he always pretended to enjoy. Probably surrounded by the same outdated motivational posters about teamwork and synergy that he'd once boasted about during our family Zoom calls, and clicked that email expecting another reshuffle. Maybe another faceless VP promoted from a boardroom in Denver, someone with a LinkedIn full of buzzwords and no real authority, but instead, what he found was a name, a photo, and a title that didn't just catch his eye, it stopped his entire morning cold. Emily Langston, Chief Strategy Officer, Echelon Systems. Oversight Portfolio, Orion Logistics, Global Division. I didn't see his reaction, of course. I wasn't there to watch the color drain from his face, or the way his mouth must have opened just slightly, confused and irritated in that way he always got when something happened that wasn't supposed to, but I didn't need to. Because I know Jake better than anyone in that building does, and I know that behind all the arrogant posturing and condescending chuckles is a man whose entire identity is wrapped around the idea of being in control, of knowing exactly who's in charge and how far up the ladder he is from everyone else. So when he read my name, when he realized that the little sister he used to joke about during happy hour was now occupying the very space that controlled the fate of his career, it wouldn't have just bruised his ego. It would have fractured the entire framework of the hierarchy he built his self-worth around, and I have to admit, there's something undeniably satisfying about knowing that the memo wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, wasn't even personalized. It was just a block of text, professionally worded, attached to a corporate signature, and yet it carried the weight of years of mockery, dismissal, and casual cruelty crashing down in a single, unassailable sentence. Still, I didn't wait for his call, didn't check to see if he'd replied to any of the internal follow-up messages, didn't even log into the employee dashboard to watch the engagement analytics. I already knew he'd seen it, and I knew that silence, that eerie, prickling silence from his side of the group chat, Was confirmation enough? For once in his life, Jake had no words. And that alone was proof that the balance had shifted. The family, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware, wrapped up in post-holiday logistics, Mom debating whether to send guests home with leftover pies, Dad complaining about the cost of turkey, Grandma muttering to herself while scrolling on her ancient iPad. And I stayed quiet, not out of pettiness or pride, but because the moment didn't call for explanation. It called for patience. Let the news travel. Let the silence fill the gaps. But it didn't take long. Around 11:30, just as I was helping rinse serving trays in the kitchen while my mother rehashed some neighborhood drama I wasn't really listening to, I felt it, that unmistakable buzz from my phone. The slight tremor of digital tension announcing itself. A message from Jake. No greeting. No subject. Just 4 words. What the hell, Emily? I stared at it for a full minute, letting the weight of those 4 words settle, considering all the versions of the response I could send, something scathing, something righteous, maybe even something petty, but in the end, I tapped back the simplest reply I could muster. One that required no embellishment, no justification, and carried just the right amount of ambiguity to let him stew. You should check with HR. I didn't respond again. I didn't need to. Because I knew that message would light a fire under him, would send him scrambling for information, for allies, for explanations, and what he'd find, buried in the HR portal beneath performance metrics and compliance training updates, was a quietly updated organizational chart, complete with a detailed restructuring plan, a new communications policy, and a reminder that all team leads were expected to participate in quarterly reviews with senior echelon leadership. Me included. Later that afternoon, the group chat came alive, Dad asking what all the tech drama was about, Mom saying something about Emily getting promoted, and Jake firing off a series of panicked half-sentences that were clearly typed in a rush between meetings or pacing sessions. He demanded clarity. He accused me of blindsiding him. He even asked, boldly, hilariously, if I could walk it back. I didn't answer. Instead, I poured myself another cup of stale coffee, sat by the window overlooking the frost-covered backyard I used to sneak cigarettes in as a teenager, and thought about how far I'd come not just in business, but in resolve. Because there was a time I might have felt guilty for this, might have questioned whether it was too personal, too harsh, too final. But not anymore. This wasn't vengeance. It was infrastructure. It was accountability. It was the inevitable result of years of being overlooked finally landing like a quiet, calculated stone in the center of a very still pond. And as the sun dipped low behind the brittle trees and Jake's messages turned from bluster to bargaining, I knew we'd reached the point of no return. Because power, real power, isn't in the yelling or the chaos. It's in the calm, the stillness. The fact that the loudest man in the room was suddenly shouting into a void, and the woman he used to laugh at wasn't just listening. She was in charge. There's a peculiar kind of unraveling that occurs when a man who's never been told no in any meaningful way is suddenly forced to reckon with the fact that the systems he once relied upon to shelter his arrogance and validate his superiority are no longer built for his comfort, and watching that process, slow, twitchy, defensive, and ultimately self-destructive, isn't always satisfying in the cinematic, triumphant way people imagine revenge to be, but rather in the quiet, inevitable way gravity pulls down a house built on hollow foundations, brick by self-important brick, until all that's left is the echo of footsteps that used to stomp with certainty and now barely shuffle with doubt. Jake was unraveling, and though I wasn't there to watch it firsthand, wasn't in the room when he met with HR, wasn't standing outside the glass wall when the director of compliance pulled up a string of his archived emails, wasn't on the call when they flagged comments from internal surveys about hostile tone, gendered language, and dismissive leadership style, I didn't need to be, because I had architected the system, I had designed the audit parameters myself, and I had made sure that the framework now in place was one that could finally see through the bluster he'd worn like armor for years. What people like Jake never seem to understand is that authority is not a default setting. It's a structure built on respect, on consistency, on the ability to lift others up without stepping on their backs, and for far too long. He had coasted through his department like a tired cliché, barking at junior staff, forwarding complaints to assistants without reading them, and making sure that anyone with a new idea knew exactly where their place was, which was beneath his, obviously. Because he had tenure, he had metrics, he had experience. But now the metrics were being reevaluated, the tenure recontextualized, and the experience questioned, not through gossip or sabotage, but through clean, procedural protocol. The kind of impersonal accountability that doesn't argue or explain, just points to the receipts and says, "Here is your reflection, whether you like it or not." The internal communications team had issued the review cycle documentation 3 days earlier, outlining expectations, grading rubrics, and the mandatory submission of 360-degree feedback reports. And while most employees received the change with either relief or cautious optimism, Jake had reportedly scoffed in the break room, made some thinly veiled joke about corporate kindergarten, and told his assistant to draft something decent and make it sound cooperative. What he hadn't realized, what he'd never bothered to consider, was that the assistant he so often barked orders at was one of the very people whose feedback would now be submitted anonymously and directly reviewed by me. That assistant, by the way, is named Lisa. She's 33, has 2 kids under 10, works weekends to cover rent, and still manages to show up on time every day with a competence and professionalism Jake never once bothered to notice, and after just 1 week of my leadership. She'd already sent me a short, precise message thanking me for finally making this place breathable. I'd flagged her profile immediately. That woman was going places. Jake, on the other hand, was going nowhere, at least nowhere he wanted to go. The thing is, I hadn't gone into this wanting to dismantle him. In fact, when the acquisition was finalized and I was presented with a list of key department heads, I'd paused when I saw his name. I'd considered a quiet reshuffling, a hands-off approach, maybe even a warning wrapped in plausible deniability. But then I remembered the years of mockery, the performative concern he'd offer when I struggled financially, those "are you okay on rent?" texts that weren't really about checking on me, but about confirming to himself that I was still beneath him. And I realized that anything less than full exposure would only allow him to slink back into the same patterns, unshaken, unbothered, unchanged. So I didn't protect him. I let the process run its course, and the process, as it turned out, was not in his favor. The feedback was damning. Not explosive, not scandalous, but quietly devastating in the way only honest peer reviews can be. Words like condescending, resistant to change, and disengaged from team culture appeared in multiple reports, and the final score, calculated through a balanced metric of output, leadership, and peer trust, ranked him in the bottom 10% of his department, a fact that HR noted with a red flag and a formal recommendation, performance improvement plan. Now, a PP isn't a firing. It's a mirror. It says, "We see you. We've measured you. And we're giving you one last chance to evolve." But for someone like Jake, who had always assumed his presence was permanent, who believed loyalty was currency and familiarity was worth more than adaptability, a PP might as well be a pink slip wrapped in corporate diplomacy. When the review hit his desk, I was told he stormed into the HR office, demanding to know who had submitted the feedback, asking why his contributions weren't being weighted appropriately, accusing the process of being biased, and, most predictably, implying that my recent elevation had somehow tainted the objectivity of the system. I wasn't present for any of this, of course. That was the beauty of it. My hands were clean, my involvement procedural, my authority unquestionable. Later that night, as the family gathered in the living room for another half-hearted movie night, Mom pouring cider, Dad adjusting the volume too loudly, Grandma crocheting in the corner like she was casting spells, I sat across from Jake, who barely looked up from his phone, his face tight and unreadable, his thumbs tapping furiously, probably trying to control the narrative among his inner circle, and I couldn't help but notice the twitch in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, the posture of a man who had, for the first time, felt the floor tilt beneath him. He didn't speak to me that evening. Not a single word. But before heading to bed, I passed behind his chair, paused just briefly, and said, low enough for only him to hear, sometimes the hardest part about growth is realizing the rules have changed, and you're not the one who gets to rewrite them. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. Because by then, he knew. He was no longer playing offense. He was being evaluated. In the final days of that long, snow-bitten week, after the tension had ripened into something thick and ambient, something that hummed beneath every fork clink and carried itself between glances across the dining table like a quiet dare, I began to understand that power, the kind that really shifts something in a person's spine, isn't wielded in declarations or outbursts, but in the weight of words unspoken, the patience of a silence that doesn't beg for recognition but waits, certain it will be, felt long after the noise dies down. We were all back at the house for what Mom called leftovers lunch, that awkward post-holiday tradition where the table is repopulated by faces that already know too much about each other and yet never seem to speak about anything of substance, preferring instead to orbit around weather, traffic, and the price of butter, as if avoidance were some sacred family heirloom passed down through generations. The ham had been reheated, the casseroles scraped back into their glass coffins, and the cranberry sauce looked even more gelatinous than it had 2 days prior, trembling slightly on its dish like it was aware it had overstayed its welcome. Jake sat to my left, quieter than I'd ever seen him, his movements smaller now, less confident, more measured, as if the space he took up was finally something he questioned rather than assumed. No one had addressed the elephant in the room directly, though the whispers had begun, trickling through the family grapevine in subtle ways, Mom asking if I had really gotten some new role, Dad vaguely referencing all this office drama, and my cousin's fiancé, Rachel, casually saying over dessert, so, are you, like, his boss now or something, with the kind of wide-eyed awe that made me both uncomfortable and deeply amused. I hadn't confirmed anything. I hadn't needed to. The memo had done its job. The HR review had played its part. And Jake, for all his years of certainty, was now navigating a terrain he no longer recognized, trying to recalibrate his identity in a world where the person he dismissed the most now held the keys to the very room he used to rule. Grandma, sharp-eyed and always far more observant than she let on, watched the room like a quiet sentinel, her cup of tea never far from her hand, her gaze flicking between Jake and me with the kind of focus that suggested she was assembling something in her mind, putting pieces together, maybe remembering every time he'd interrupted me at family dinners or corrected my stories or laughed just a little too loudly when I said something ambitious. And then, with the casualness of a woman who'd seen far too much to be impressed by anything anymore, she began to speak, not to me, and not to him, but to the room in general, her voice soft and slow. Like she wasn't telling a story so much as unspooling a thread that had been knotted for decades. She talked about a job offer she once received when she was barely 24, a manager position at the textile mill downstate, how the supervisor had said she had the best organizational brain he'd ever seen, and how she'd gone home excited, practically buzzing with possibility, until her mother looked at the offer letter and said, "That's a man's job, dear," and handed it back to her like it was radioactive. She said she hadn't thought about that letter in years, that she'd gone on to be a mother and a wife and, eventually, a grandmother, but sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the clock ticked louder than it should, she wondered what her life would have looked like if she'd taken that job and never asked for permission to want more. The room was silent as she spoke. Even the kids, usually fidgeting or giggling, sat still, listening with the kind of reverence that only truth, raw, unsanitized truth, can summon. When she finished, she turned to me, didn't smile, didn't wink, just looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You know, you always did have the better brain." And then she went back to sipping her tea as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb so elegant it didn't even make a sound when it landed. Jake didn't speak. Not for the rest of the meal. He didn't argue, didn't joke, didn't deflect with some story about his fantasy football league. He simply picked at his plate like someone unsure of whether or not they were still hungry, and for once, he seemed aware of the air around him, aware of the weight his presence used to carry and how light it now felt, how uncertain. Later, As people began packing up, zipping jackets and gathering Tupperware containers, I pulled Lisa aside, his assistant, the woman he'd ignored and undervalued for 3 straight years, and offered her a position in another department, one with better pay, better hours, and a direct path to leadership if she wanted it. She looked at me like I'd just handed her a map out of a maze she didn't even realize she was trapped in, and when she asked if this was about Jake, I shook my head and said, "This is about you." Jake saw us talking, of course. Watched the exchange from the hallway, half hidden behind the coat rack, his expression unreadable. And when our eyes met, he walked over, slow and unsure, like a man stepping onto unfamiliar ice, and asked, in a voice low enough that no one else could hear, "So, what are you going to do with the company?" I could have said 100 things, could have listed my goals, the reorg plans, the staffing shifts, the strategic expansion initiatives, but instead I simply said, "Same thing I've always done. Keep building what you never saw coming." That was it. No dramatic exit, no final insult, no cinematic pause. Just the truth, dropped like a stone into still water. And later, long after the leftovers had been distributed and the cars had pulled away and the house had gone quiet again, I sat in the driver's seat of my rental, watching the frost gather along the edges of the windshield, when my phone buzzed. A message from one of the Echelon board assistants. He just applied for a role in another department. Do we block it? I stared at the screen for a long moment, thinking about everything that had happened, not just this week, but across the years, every insult, every eye roll, every time I'd had to bite my tongue so hard I tasted iron, and then I smiled, a small, private thing, and typed my response slowly, deliberately, with the kind of clarity that comes only after you've won something more meaningful than a single battle. No. Let him work his way up. If he can. And with that, I set the phone down, shifted the car into drive, and pulled away from the house where everything had once felt impossible, knowing, finally, that I would never need to explain myself to anyone sitting around that table ever again.